Okay, this problem is for those of you that use some kind of online homework math system, math software online. So what problems we've shown so far that can only really be done by hand, you're kind of writing them all out, and I definitely expect you guys to write it out by hand as you're doing problems of this. So even though it has multiple choice answers, you still want to do your work by showing your work because that's the way you can verify that these are correct. So if you have one of those online homework rating systems, unfortunately we're limited on the technology. We can't really show all the work out. So these kind of problems on that kind of system are usually displayed like this as a multiple choice. Here's the original problem. Cosine minus secant is equal to negative sine theta tangent theta. Here's the different choices. What you're going to be doing here is you're really checking for if they're doing the correct algebraic maneuver on these. Sometimes they'll put in a wrong identity, or sometimes they forget a sign, things like that. So you want to actually check the work to see which one is correct. Now the best way to do this would be actually do the problem by hand and then look at the answer choices to see if we're on the right path. So first of all, let's assume that we want to start by doing this. Now what I would do is, my technique says I would change everything over into sines and cosines. So I'm going to go ahead and change this. So the first thing I would do is I would say cosine, and then I would change the secant into 1 over cosine by using our identity. So the first step that I would do by hand would be to go ahead and change it into here. And of course what I'd also do is I would change the other side into sines and cosines as well. So I'm going to do sine theta over cosine theta. So now I have this. So therefore, by looking at that, I'm going to see which one has this correct first step here. So I'm going to look for the one that has 1 over cosine. Now I notice that A is going to be no good because it has a wrong identity in there. It's got 1 minus sine. So does C. So already I can eliminate A and C as my answers because my first step was not correct. It used the wrong identity. Okay? And then the next thing I would do here is I would want to get some common denominators with that. So what I would do is multiply top and bottom by cosine over cosine, and I would get cosine squared theta minus 1 over cosine theta. That would be the next step that I would do if I were doing this by hand. Of course I would carry down this same step here and leave it like that. Okay. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my list of identities that I had on the board and for the previous examples. I want to pick one that looks like this. Now when I look through, I notice that I have this one. I have sine squared theta is equal to 1 minus cosine squared, but I don't have cosine squared minus 1. So in order to get that to work, what you can do is if you multiply both sides here by a negative, you'll be able to get this order to switch. So if I put a negative sign in front of the sine squared and a negative sign in front of here, what I'd be able to do is if I multiply through by a negative, what that does is it allows me to switch the order because I get negative 1 plus cosine squared. Negative 1 plus is the same thing as cosine squared minus 1, which is what I have here. So therefore, I need to put in a negative sine squared. So negative sine squared theta would be my next step if I'm doing this one by hand. So I have to look here. There's a bunch of steps I had to do to get it to turn into here, and a lot of times these might skip some steps, so that's why again it's good to do it by hand, because then you want to get to a point where you can see the next step here. So now I know that I got to have a negative in there, so because this one doesn't have a negative, I can automatically cross out B, and I know that D is going to be the correct answer. It correctly shows the next step, negative sine squared, and what I can do is I can say that if I were to simplify this right hand side, that's equal to negative sine squared over cosine. So then that's a way I can show that both sides would be equal, and that's how it works out. So you might do it a slightly different by hand than what it has on the computer. But again, that's the process. You want to just basically look for by hand which one is doing that correct. So we're going through all the different steps here. We find out that the correct one is going to be D.